God's delays often protect us from what we cannot see. When we pray and do not receive an immediate answer, we may feel frustrated, wondering why God is taking so long. But what we often fail to realize is that His delays are not denials. They are acts of divine protection. There are dangers, obstacles, and situations ahead that we are unaware of, and in His wisdom, God withholds certain things until the timing is right. If we receive something prematurely, we may not be ready for it, or it may not be the blessing we assume it to be. God, in His infinite knowledge, sees the full picture, and He orchestrates the details of our lives according to what is best for us. Many times what looks like a delay is actually God shielding us from harm. In the Bible, we see numerous examples where what seemed like an unnecessary wait was actually a divine act of protection. When the Israelites were freed from Egypt, God did not lead them on the shortest route to the Promised Land. Instead, He took them the long way around through the wilderness. To them, it may have seemed like an unnecessary delay, but God knew that if they faced war immediately, they would lose heart and return to Egypt. He delayed their journey to protect them from battles they were not ready to fight. The delay was not a punishment, it was preparation and protection. In our own lives, we often desire something so intensely that we become impatient with God's timing. We may long for a new opportunity, a promotion, a relationship, or a breakthrough, but God withholds it for a reason. Sometimes He is protecting us from people who are not meant to be in our lives. Other times He is shielding us from entering a situation that would bring unnecessary pain or struggle. We may not see the danger ahead, but God does, and in His love He prevents us from stepping into something that is not right for us. Consider the story of Joseph. As a young man, he had dreams of leadership and greatness. If it had been up to him, he would have stepped into his calling immediately. But God allowed a long delay before those dreams were fulfilled. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. From a human perspective, it seemed unfair and unnecessary. But what Joseph did not realize at the time was that God was protecting him. Had he stayed with his brothers, they might have harmed him out of jealousy. Had he risen to power too soon, he may not have been mature enough to handle the responsibility. God's delay positioned him in the right place at the right time, so that when the moment of elevation came, he was fully prepared and able to handle the blessing. God's delays also protect us from making decisions based on emotion rather than wisdom. Many people rush into situations out of impatience, only to regret their choices later. They take jobs that are not right for them, enter relationships that bring pain, or make financial decisions that lead to hardship. But when we trust God's timing, we allow Him to guide our steps and keep us from stepping into something that is not meant for us. What seems like a delay is often God's way of giving us time to grow in wisdom and discernment, so that when the right opportunity comes, we can step into it with confidence and clarity. Sometimes God's delays are about preparing the circumstances around us rather than just preparing us. There may be people who need to be removed from or added to our lives before we can step into what God has for us. There may be events that need to take place before the timing is right. If we rush ahead of God, we may step into something prematurely and miss out on His perfect plan. But if we trust Him, we can rest knowing that His timing is always best. God's delays also protect us from spiritual dangers that we may not recognize. There are times when a door remains closed because God knows that if we walk through it now, we may become prideful, distracted, or drawn away from Him. He may delay a blessing until our hearts are fully surrendered to Him, ensuring that when we receive it, we will remain humble and dependent on Him. He knows that some blessings, if given too soon, can lead to spiritual downfall rather than growth. When we face delays, it is easy to become discouraged, thinking that God has forgotten us. But He never forgets. Every delay has a purpose, and more often than not, that purpose is our protection. What seems like a disappointment today may later be revealed as one of God's greatest acts of mercy in our lives. If we could see what He sees, we would understand that His timing is always for our good. Even when we do not understand, we can trust that His ways are higher than ours and that He is always working for our benefit. God's delays teach us patience and endurance. When we ask God for something and do not receive an immediate answer, it is natural to feel frustrated. We live in a world where instant gratification is expected, where we want results quickly, and where waiting often feels like a waste of time. But God does not operate on our schedule. He is more interested in building our character than in giving us everything we want at the moment we desire it. Delays are not meant to discourage us. They are meant to develop patience and endurance within us, strengthening our faith and deepening our trust in Him. Patience is one of the greatest lessons we can learn in our spiritual journey. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to wait on God's timing before stepping into their calling. Abraham was promised a son, but he had to wait 25 years before Isaac was born. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. David was anointed as king while still a young shepherd, but he endured years of trials and battles before finally taking the throne. Each of these individuals faced delays, but those delays served a purpose. They were not wasted time. They were seasons of growth, refinement, and preparation. When we face delays in our own lives, we must recognize that God is teaching us something valuable. Patience is not simply the ability to wait. It is the ability to wait with the right attitude. Many people wait on God, but they do so with frustration, complaining, or doubting His faithfulness. True patience is trusting that God is in control, even when things do not happen according to our timeline. It is believing that His plans are better than our own, and that His timing is perfect even when we do not understand it. Endurance is also developed through delays. Life is not a sprint, it is a marathon. If we are to fulfill God's purpose for our lives, we need to develop the kind of faith that does not give up when things take longer than expected. Trials, setbacks, and unanswered prayers are not meant to weaken us, they are meant to strengthen us. Every time we choose to trust God in the waiting, our endurance grows. We become stronger in our faith, more steadfast in our commitment, and more prepared for the blessings that God has in store for us. Consider the life of Joseph. He had a dream that he would one day be in a position of great authority. But instead of stepping into that dream immediately, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. From a human perspective, it seemed like his life was moving in the opposite direction of God's promise. But through those years of waiting, Joseph developed patience and endurance. He remained faithful to God even in difficult circumstances. He did not allow delays to make him bitter. Instead, he used them as opportunities to grow. When the time finally came for him to step into his calling, he was fully prepared to handle the responsibility. Had he not gone through the process of waiting, he would not have been ready for the position God had prepared for him. Waiting on God is never easy, but it is always necessary. It is in the waiting that we learn to rely on Him completely. It is in the waiting that we develop the strength to keep going even when things do not go as planned. The Bible tells us in James 1:03, verse 4, "The testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This means that delays are part of God's refining process. They are not meant to harm us. They are meant to shape us into people who are mature in our faith and ready for what He has in store. Many times, we want God to move quickly, but He wants to move deeply. If He answered every prayer instantly, we would never learn endurance. If every blessing came without delay, we would never develop patience. God knows that strong faith is built in the waiting. When we embrace the process instead of resisting it, we allow Him to do a deeper work in our hearts. We begin to see delays not as obstacles, but as opportunities for growth. We learn to trust that even when we cannot see what God is doing, He is still working behind the scenes. There will always be times in life when we must wait on God. The question is not whether we will face delays, but how we will respond to them. If we respond with faith, patience, and perseverance, we will come out stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the blessings ahead. The waiting season is never wasted. It is a time of preparation, a time of strengthening, and a time of deepening our relationship with God. When we understand this, we can wait with confidence, knowing that God's timing is always perfect. God uses delays to prepare us. When we pray for something and do not receive an immediate answer, it is easy to assume that God is withholding the blessing or that He is not listening. But in reality, delays are often a sign that God is at work behind the scenes, preparing us for what is to come. If we receive a blessing too soon, we may not be ready to handle it. God is not just concerned with giving us what we ask for. He is concerned with shaping us into the kind of people who can carry the blessing with wisdom, maturity, and responsibility. Throughout the Bible, we see that every great man and woman of faith went through a period of waiting before stepping into their destiny. God did not rush their process. He allowed them to go through seasons of preparation, testing, and growth so that when the time was right, they would be fully equipped for the assignment He had for them. This pattern reveals an important truth. If God is delaying something in our lives, it is because He is working on us as much as He is working on the circumstances around us. One of the most powerful examples of this is seen in the life of Joseph. As a young man, he had a dream that he would one day be a ruler, but instead of stepping into that role immediately, he faced a series of hardships, being sold into slavery by his own brothers, wrongfully accused, and thrown into prison. From a human perspective, it seemed like his life was going in the opposite direction of his calling. But in reality, every difficulty he faced was part of God's preparation process. In Potiphar's house, he learned leadership and integrity. In prison, he learned patience and endurance. By the time he was elevated to the position of second in command over Egypt, he was not only capable of handling the responsibility, but he had also developed the character necessary to steward it well. Had Joseph gone straight from being a shepherd boy to being a ruler, he would not have been ready. The delays were not a punishment, they were a preparation. Moses also experienced a long season of preparation before stepping into his calling. He knew from a young age that he was meant to deliver the Israelites from slavery, but his initial attempt to take matters into his own hands resulted in failure. He ended up fleeing to the wilderness, where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. To the outside world, it may have seemed like he had been forgotten, but in reality, God was using that time to shape him into the leader He needed him to be. By the time God called him at the burning bush, Moses had been humbled, trained, and prepared for the immense responsibility of leading God's people. David's journey also illustrates the importance of preparation through delay. He was anointed as king while still a young shepherd, yet he did not take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years serving King Saul, facing battles, and enduring hardships. During that time, God was molding him into a leader who would rule with wisdom and integrity. If David had become king the moment he was anointed, he would not have been ready. The waiting season was necessary to prepare him for the weight of the crown. In our own lives, we may not always understand why certain prayers seem to go unanswered or why we are stuck in seasons of waiting. But if we trust that God is using the delay to prepare us, we can approach the waiting with faith instead of frustration. Sometimes God needs to refine our character before He can release the blessing. If we are impatient, He teaches us patience. If we are prideful, He humbles us. If we lack wisdom, He gives us experiences that will shape us into people who can handle greater responsibility. We see this in everyday life as well. A child is not given the keys to a car before they are ready to drive. An athlete does not compete in a championship without first enduring years of training. A student does not receive a degree without going through the necessary education. Likewise, God does not place us in positions of influence, responsibility, or blessing before we are ready. He takes time to prepare us so that when we do step into His promises, we will not only receive the blessing, but we will also be able to sustain it. Many times we think we are ready when we are not. We may believe we are prepared for a new opportunity, a relationship, or a breakthrough, but God sees what we cannot. He knows what is ahead, and in His wisdom, He delays certain things for our protection and growth. What feels like a delay is often God's way of preventing us from stepping into something too soon. If we receive a blessing prematurely, we may mishandle it, lose it, or become overwhelmed by it. But when we wait for God's perfect timing, we can step into His plans with confidence, knowing that we are truly prepared for what He has in store. God's delays often reveal what is in our hearts. When we face delays in life, when the breakthrough we are praying for does not come as quickly as we expect, our true attitudes, desires, and level of trust in God begin to surface. It is easy to say we trust God when everything is going smoothly, but it is in the waiting season that our faith is tested. Delays show us whether we truly believe in God's timing or if we only trust Him when things happen on our schedule. They expose whether we are seeking God for who He is or simply for what He can give us. When the Israelites were delivered from Egypt, they had high expectations that they would quickly enter the promised land. But when they encountered obstacles and delays along the way, their true hearts were revealed. Instead of trusting that God had a purpose in the delay, they complained, doubted, and even wished to return to slavery. Their response to the waiting period showed that their faith was weak and that their hearts were not fully surrendered to God's will. This is why what should have been an 11-day journey turned into a 40-year wandering in the wilderness. The delay was not just about timing, it was about testing their hearts, refining their faith, and preparing them for what was ahead. The same principle applies to us. When things do not happen as quickly as we desire, do we trust God or do we become frustrated and impatient? Do we continue to seek Him or do we allow bitterness to take root in our hearts? Delays are not meant to destroy our faith, they are meant to refine it. They bring to the surface any areas where we are not fully surrendered to God. If there is impatience in us, a delay will expose it. If we struggle with control, a delay will highlight our need to let go and trust God. If our faith is based on circumstances, a delay will reveal whether we are truly anchored in Him. Abraham and Sarah faced a long delay in receiving God's promise of a son. At first they believed wholeheartedly, but as the years passed and nothing seemed to change, doubt crept into their hearts. Instead of waiting for God's perfect timing, they took matters into their own hands, and Ishmael was born. This decision led to unnecessary struggles and conflict that could have been avoided if they had fully trusted in God's timing. The delay revealed that their faith still had room to grow. But despite their initial misstep, God remained faithful, and in His perfect time, Isaac was born. Delays also reveal whether we are seeking God for the right reasons. If we only seek Him when we want something, then a delay will test our devotion. God desires a relationship with us, not just a transactional faith where we come to Him only when we need a breakthrough. Waiting seasons help us examine whether we love God for who He is or if we are only following Him for His blessings. True faith says, God, even if I do not see the answer right away, I will still trust You. Even if You delay the blessing, I will continue to seek You because You are my greatest treasure. Joseph's life is another example of how delays reveal the heart. When he was given a dream about his future, he could have become proud and impatient, demanding that God fulfill it immediately. But instead, when he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, he remained faithful. The delay tested his character, and through that process, God prepared him for the leadership role he would one day hold. Had Joseph grown bitter or abandoned his faith during the delay, he would not have been ready when the moment of elevation came. His waiting season was a refining season, shaping him into the man God needed him to be. In our own lives, when God allows a delay, it is an opportunity to self-reflect. Do we become angry when things do not happen on our timeline? Do we compare ourselves to others and question why they seem to be advancing while we are still waiting? Do we trust that God's plan is best, or do we try to force things to happen in our own strength? These are the questions that delays bring to the surface. If we respond with faith, patience, and surrender, we will come out of the waiting season stronger, more mature, and more aligned with God's will. God does not allow delays to punish us, but to prepare us and refine us. He wants to bless us, but He is more concerned with who we are becoming than how quickly we receive what we desire. When we embrace the waiting season with the right heart, we develop endurance, spiritual maturity, and a deeper trust in God. Delays are not an indication that God has forgotten about us. They are a sign that He is doing a deeper work in us. Every moment of waiting is an opportunity to draw closer to Him, to surrender more fully, and to develop the kind of faith that is unshaken by circumstances. God's timing is always perfect. It is one of the most difficult truths to accept, especially when we are waiting for something important. We live in a world that values speed, efficiency, and instant results, but God operates on a different timeline. His ways are higher than ours, and His timing is never early or late. It is always right on schedule. When we fully embrace this truth, we learn to rest in Him, knowing that He is in control of every detail of our lives. There are moments when we pray, believing for an answer, but instead of an immediate response, we face silence. The waiting season can feel frustrating, confusing, and even painful. Our minds begin to question whether we misunderstood God's promise or if He has forgotten about us. But the reality is that every delay has a purpose. Every moment of waiting is part of a divine process that we may not understand at the time, but one day we will see how perfectly God orchestrated every event for our good. One of the greatest examples of God's perfect timing is found in the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a son, but years passed without any sign of fulfillment. As they grew older, it seemed humanly impossible for the promise to come to pass. Their patience wavered, and in their desire to speed up the process, they took matters into their own hands. Sarah gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, and Ishmael was born. But Ishmael was not the child of promise. He was the result of human effort trying to force God's plan. It was only when the time was right, according to God's divine schedule, that Isaac was born. This story reminds us that trying to rush God's timing can lead to unnecessary struggles. When we wait for His perfect timing, the blessing comes in a way that is beyond what we could have imagined. Another powerful example is the life of Joseph. He had a dream that one day he would be in a position of great authority. But instead of stepping into that promise immediately, he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. From a human perspective, it seemed like everything in his life was going wrong. But God was aligning circumstances in a way that Joseph could not see. Every delay, every setback, and every hardship was positioning him for something greater. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated to second in command over all of Egypt, and he was able to save an entire nation from famine. Had he been released from prison even a day earlier or later, he would have missed the opportunity God had prepared for him. God's timing is also seen in the life of Jesus. When Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus was sick, they expected him to come immediately. But instead of rushing to their side, Jesus delayed his arrival. By the time he reached them, Lazarus had already died. From their perspective, it seemed too late. They had prayed, they had believed, but their brother was gone. Yet Jesus had a greater plan. His delay was not a denial. It was an opportunity to reveal God's glory in a way that no one expected. He raised Lazarus from the dead, demonstrating that God's power is not limited by human timelines. This story teaches us that even when it seems like all hope is lost, God is still in control. What looks like a delay to us is often a setup for something greater. Waiting on God's timing requires trust. It means surrendering our own expectations and believing that He knows what is best. It is not always easy, but when we reflect on His past faithfulness, we begin to see a pattern. He has never failed us before, and He will not fail us now. The times we thought He was late, He was actually setting things in motion in a way that we could not yet see. The moments we thought He had forgotten about us, He was actually working behind the scenes, preparing a blessing greater than what we had prayed for. Sometimes God's timing feels slow because He is working on something in us. He is developing patience, deepening our faith, and preparing our hearts for what is coming. If we receive a blessing before we are ready, we may mishandle it, take it for granted, or fail to steward it well. Just as a parent would not give a car to a child who is not ready to drive, God withholds certain things until we are mature enough to handle them. His timing is not just about the right moment. It is about the right person. He is shaping us into the person who can carry the responsibility that comes with the blessing. When we trust in God's perfect timing, we find peace, even in the waiting. We no longer strive to force things to happen, and we do not let anxiety consume us when things do not unfold as we expected. Instead, we rest in the assurance that God sees the full picture. He knows the exact moment when everything will align, and when that time comes, nothing can stop His plan from unfolding. Every delay has a purpose, and every moment of waiting is leading us closer to the fulfillment of His promises. Delays are a test of faith. When we pray for something and do not receive an immediate answer, it is easy to become discouraged. We wonder if God has heard us, if He cares, or if we did something wrong. But delays are not meant to discourage us. They are designed to strengthen our faith. They reveal what we truly believe about God, whether we trust Him or only seek Him for what He can give us. A delay is not a sign of rejection. It is an opportunity to grow in faith, patience, and endurance. Faith is not just believing when everything is going well. It is trusting God even when nothing seems to be happening. It is in the waiting that we find out if our faith is truly anchored in Him or if it is based on circumstances. Anyone can have faith when life is easy, but real faith is tested in the moments when we do not see evidence of what we are believing for. Delays force us to rely on God rather than our own understanding. They challenge us to walk by faith and not by sight, believing that His promises will come to pass, even when there is no visible sign of progress. Abraham faced one of the greatest tests of faith when God promised him a son. Decades passed and nothing changed. He and Sarah grew older, and from a human perspective, it seemed impossible for them to have a child. Yet, despite the delay, Abraham held on to God's promise. The Bible says that he did not waver through unbelief, but was strengthened in his faith, giving glory to God. His faith was tested, but he chose to believe that what God had said would come to pass in His perfect timing. Delays also test our attitude and response. When things do not happen as quickly as we expect, we have a choice. We can either grow bitter and frustrated, or we can use the delay to develop patience and trust. The Israelites struggled with this during their journey to the Promised Land. Instead of trusting God, they complained and doubted. Their lack of faith turned an 11-day journey into a 40-year wilderness experience. The delay was meant to test their faith and prepare them for the land flowing with milk and honey, but many of them failed the test because they allowed impatience to rule their hearts. Joseph is another example of someone who experienced a long delay before stepping into his destiny. He had a dream of leadership and greatness, but instead of seeing it fulfilled immediately, he was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Every step of his journey seemed to move him further away from his dream. But Joseph did not let the delay shake his faith. He remained faithful, trusting that God was in control, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated to second in command over Egypt, and everything God had promised came to pass. Delays are also a way for God to purify our motives. Sometimes we desire something for the wrong reasons, and the waiting period helps us evaluate whether our hearts are truly aligned with God's will. If we are seeking a blessing only for our own gain, God may delay it until we learn to seek Him above all else. He wants us to desire Him more than we desire the blessing. The test of faith is not just about waiting. It is about waiting with the right heart. It is about saying, Lord, even if it takes longer than I expected, I will still trust You. Even if I do not see an answer today, I will not waver in my faith. Delays often separate those who have shallow faith from those who have deep, unshakable trust in God. Many people start strong in their faith, but when things do not happen quickly, they give up. They let doubt take root and assume that God's silence means He has abandoned them. But those who endure, who hold on to God's promises despite the delays, are the ones who will see His faithfulness revealed in powerful ways. They understand that God is never in a hurry, yet He is never late. They recognize that the waiting period is not wasted time, it is preparation time. God is not only concerned with what He is doing for us, He is also concerned with what He is doing in us. He uses delays to refine our character, to teach us patience, and to strengthen our trust in Him. Every moment of waiting is an opportunity to grow spiritually, to develop resilience, and to build the kind of faith that remains strong no matter what. If we can trust Him in the waiting, we can trust Him in the fulfillment. If we can hold on to His promises during the delays, we will be able to stand firm when the blessing finally arrives. God is preparing you for something greater. Often in life, we find ourselves in seasons where nothing seems to be moving forward. Prayers seem unanswered, opportunities seem scarce, and we feel as if we are stuck in a cycle of waiting. It is in these moments that doubt and frustration can creep in, making us question whether God has forgotten about us. But what we often fail to see is that the delay is not a sign of neglect. It is a sign of preparation. God never wastes time. When it feels like nothing is happening, He is working behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, refining your heart, and preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine. If He were to give you everything immediately, without the necessary preparation, you might not be ready to handle it. Just as a seed needs time underground before it sprouts into a strong tree, you need time to develop the wisdom, maturity, and strength required for what God has planned for you. Consider the life of Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, a vision of himself in a position of power and leadership. But before that dream could become a reality, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From a human perspective, it seemed like everything in his life was going in the wrong direction. But in reality, God was using every experience to prepare him. If Joseph had stepped into leadership too soon, without the lessons learned through hardship, he would not have been able to handle the responsibility. When the time was right, God elevated him, and everything he had endured made sense. David had a similar experience. He was anointed as king while still a shepherd, but he did not immediately take the throne. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness, running from Saul, fighting battles, and learning to trust God in the most difficult situations. Those years were not wasted. They were a time of refining. God was shaping him into the kind of king who would lead with wisdom, humility, and faith. Without that period of preparation, he might not have been the leader that Israel needed. Sometimes the things we go through feel unnecessary or even unfair. We wonder why we have to struggle, why doors are closing, or why God seems to be delaying his promises. But every trial, every closed door, and every waiting season is part of God's preparation process. He is strengthening your character, building your endurance, and teaching you lessons that will be crucial for the next season of your life. There are times when we think we are ready for something, but God knows we are not. He sees the full picture, while we only see a small part of it. He knows what lies ahead, and he understands the kind of person we need to become in order to handle the blessings he has prepared. If we receive something prematurely without the necessary preparation, we may misuse it or fail to appreciate it fully. That is why God in his wisdom takes us through seasons of waiting, refining, and equipping. The process of preparation is not always comfortable. It often involves challenges, disappointments, and unexpected detours. But it is in these moments that our faith is tested and our trust in God is deepened. If we can embrace the process instead of resisting it, we will begin to see the purpose behind it. Every difficulty is shaping us. Every delay is teaching us patience, and every obstacle is building resilience. Think about a potter working with clay. Before the clay can become a beautiful and useful vessel, it must be shaped, molded, and refined. Sometimes it has to go through the fire to be strengthened. In the same way, God is shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for the greater things he has in store. He is molding your character, sharpening your abilities, and aligning circumstances so that when the right time comes, you will be fully prepared to step into your purpose. When we understand that God's delays are not denials, but rather seasons of preparation, our perspective shifts. We no longer see waiting as wasted time, but as a necessary part of the journey. Instead of growing discouraged, we learn to trust that God knows what he is doing. He has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned his promises, and he is not ignoring your prayers. He is preparing you for something far greater than you could have ever imagined. Trusting God in the waiting is an essential part of faith. It is in the waiting that our belief in his promises is tested, stretched, and strengthened. Waiting is never easy. It challenges our patience, exposes our doubts, and forces us to confront our fears. But if we learn to trust God in these seasons, we will develop a deeper, more unshakable faith that will sustain us in every area of life. One of the greatest struggles we face as believers is trusting God when nothing seems to be happening. When prayers go unanswered and breakthroughs feel distant, we begin to wonder if God is really listening. The temptation to take matters into our own hands grows stronger, and frustration sets in. But true faith is demonstrated not when we see immediate results, but when we choose to trust in God's goodness even in the silence. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of people who had to trust God in the waiting. Abraham was promised that he would be the father of many nations, but years passed with no child. Instead of fully trusting God's timing, he and Sarah tried to rush the process, leading to unnecessary complications. Yet despite their impatience, God remained faithful, and when the time was right, Sarah gave birth to Isaac. This story teaches us that God's promises are not dependent on our timeline, but on his perfect plan. Joseph's journey is another powerful example. God gave him a dream of leadership and influence, but instead of stepping into that promise immediately, he was betrayed, enslaved, imprisoned, and forgotten. From a human perspective, it seemed like his life was moving further away from the vision God had given him. But what Joseph didn't realize was that every delay, every hardship, and every moment of waiting was preparing him for what was to come. When the right time arrived, Joseph was elevated to a position of great authority, and everything God had promised came to pass. Waiting often feels like wandering through the unknown. There are moments when we feel lost, uncertain, and confused about what God is doing. But even in the waiting, God is working. Just because we cannot see progress does not mean that progress is not happening. Sometimes God is aligning circumstances, preparing opportunities, and refining our hearts in ways we cannot yet perceive. One of the greatest challenges in waiting is learning to surrender control. As humans, we like to have a sense of certainty. We want to know when and how things will happen. But trusting God means letting go of our need for control and believing that His plan is better than ours. When we try to force things to happen in our own strength, we often end up frustrated, exhausted, and disappointed. But when we surrender to God's timing, we find peace in knowing that He is leading us exactly where we need to be. Waiting is also a time of growth. It is in these seasons that God shapes our character, strengthens our faith, and teaches us valuable lessons that we would not learn otherwise. If everything happened instantly, we would miss out on the depth of faith that comes from relying on God through uncertainty. Waiting teaches us perseverance, builds endurance, and deepens our trust in God's faithfulness. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. God had promised them the promised land, but because of their lack of trust, they spent years wandering instead of walking into their destiny. Instead of using their waiting time to grow in faith, they complained, doubted, and questioned God's plan. Their story serves as a reminder that how we wait matters. If we wait with faith, gratitude, and trust, we will be prepared for what God has in store. Jesus also demonstrated the power of trusting God in the waiting. Before beginning his ministry, he spent years in preparation. Even when he was urged to reveal himself sooner, he remained patient, saying, "My time has not yet come." His obedience to God's timing teaches us that waiting is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. When we learn to trust God in the waiting, we discover that delays are not denials, but divine preparations. We develop a stronger faith, a deeper relationship with God, and a greater sense of peace, knowing that His plans are always good. Every moment of waiting is an opportunity to draw closer to Him, to build endurance, and to prepare for the blessings that are on the way. Delay is a test of faith, not a rejection. When we find ourselves waiting on God for an answer, a breakthrough, or a promise to be fulfilled, it is easy to assume that the delay means we have been overlooked, forgotten, or even denied. However, one of the greatest lessons we can learn in our walk with God is that delay does not equal denial. Instead, it is often a divine test designed to refine, strengthen, and deepen our faith. Faith is not truly tested when everything happens immediately. It is tested in the waiting, in the moments when we do not see any evidence of progress and when our prayers seem unanswered. This is where we learn to trust God's heart even when we cannot trace His hand. When we face delays, the enemy often whispers lies, trying to convince us that God is not listening, that He does not care, or that we are not worthy of His blessings. But the truth is, a delay from God is often His way of stretching our faith and preparing us for something greater. Throughout Scripture, we see that God frequently allows delays in the lives of those He has called, not because He has abandoned them, but because He is shaping them for their destiny. Take the example of Moses. He knew from a young age that he was called to deliver the Israelites from slavery, yet he spent 40 years in the wilderness before stepping into that role. It was in that season of waiting that God molded him into the leader he was meant to be. If Moses had tried to force God's plan in his own timing, he would not have been ready to fulfill his calling. David was another example of how delay is a test of faith. Anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, David had to endure years of waiting before he ever sat on the throne. During that time, he faced battles, betrayals, and hardships. There were moments when it seemed as if the promise would never come to pass. But each delay was not a rejection. It was a time of preparation. God was strengthening his character, teaching him to rely fully on Him, and refining him into a man after His own heart. When the time was right, David stepped into his destiny, fully equipped for the role God had ordained for him. Many times, delays expose what is truly in our hearts. They reveal whether we are seeking God for who He is or simply for what He can give us. When answers do not come as quickly as we want, do we still remain faithful? Do we continue to trust, worship, and obey Him even when we do not see immediate results? True faith is demonstrated in those moments when we choose to stand firm, even when everything in us wants to give up. Another powerful example is Hannah, who longed for a child but remained barren for years. In her pain and desperation, she continued to seek God. It was in her waiting season that she developed a deeper relationship with Him. When God finally answered her prayer and gave her Samuel, she dedicated him back to the Lord, showing that her faith had grown through the delay. Had she received her blessing instantly, she might not have had the same level of surrender and trust in God's plan. Sometimes God's delays are about timing, but other times they are about transformation. He is more interested in shaping our character than simply granting our requests. If we receive a blessing too soon, we may not have the wisdom or maturity to handle it properly. Just as a loving parent does not give a child something they are not ready for, God withholds certain things until we are prepared to steward them well. Jesus Himself experienced divine delays. When He was baptized, the heavens opened and God declared Him as His beloved Son. Yet instead of immediately beginning His ministry, Jesus was led into the wilderness for 40 days of testing. It was a season of preparation before stepping into His calling. Even at the wedding in Cana, when His mother asked Him to perform a miracle, He responded, "My hour has not yet come." Jesus understood that God's timing is perfect and that no amount of human urging could rush His divine plan. Waiting seasons are never wasted seasons. They are opportunities for growth, for deepening our trust in God, and for allowing Him to work in us before He works through us. When we embrace delays as divine tests rather than rejections, we shift our perspective. Instead of feeling discouraged, we can rest in the assurance that God is working, even when we cannot see it. Just as gold is refined in the fire, our faith is purified in the waiting. And when the appointed time arrives, what God has promised will come to pass in a way that exceeds anything we could have imagined. Waiting builds patience and character. One of the greatest challenges in life is enduring seasons of waiting. Whether it is waiting for a breakthrough, an answer to prayer, or a long-anticipated blessing, the process can feel difficult and frustrating. However, in God's divine plan, waiting is never wasted. Instead, it is a tool He uses to shape us, refine us, and develop the patience and character needed to sustain the blessings He has prepared for us. Patience is not something that comes naturally. As human beings, we tend to desire instant results, quick solutions, and immediate fulfillment of our prayers. We live in a fast-paced world where almost everything is designed for convenience and speed. Yet God's kingdom does not operate on human timelines. He is not in a hurry, and He is far more concerned with who we are becoming than with how quickly we reach our destination. True patience is developed in the waiting process, and it is through waiting that we learn to trust God more deeply. Throughout the Bible, we see that God often required His greatest servants to wait before stepping into their calling. Abraham had to wait decades before Isaac was born, even though God had promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. Joseph endured years of hardship before he was elevated to a position of authority. David was anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, yet he spent years in the wilderness before he took the throne. These delays were not punishments, they were seasons of preparation. During these times, their patience was tested, their faith was stretched, and their character was strengthened. When we wait on God, He is working in ways we may not understand. Waiting is not just about delaying the blessing. It is about shaping the person who will receive it. If we were given everything we wanted the moment we asked for it, we might not appreciate it fully, nor would we have the wisdom to handle it well. God uses waiting to refine us, removing impatience, pride, and selfishness, and replacing them with endurance, humility, and dependence on Him. Character is developed in the moments when we feel forgotten, overlooked, or stuck in circumstances beyond our control. These seasons teach us perseverance, strengthen our ability to endure hardships, and remind us that our faith is not based on what we see, but on who God is. If we can trust Him in the waiting, we can trust Him in every other area of life. Waiting also reveals what is in our hearts. It exposes whether we truly trust God or if we are only seeking Him for what He can give us. Many people start strong in their faith, but when delays come, their trust begins to waver. Some become frustrated and take matters into their own hands, like Abraham and Sarah did when they decided to bring about God's promise in their own way. But every time we try to rush God's plan, we create unnecessary complication. True character is shown in those who can wait with faith, knowing that God's timing is perfect and that His plans are worth the patience required. Consider the example of the Israelites in the wilderness. They were meant to enter the promised land, but because of their lack of patience and their constant complaints, they wandered for 40 years. God had to refine their hearts before they could step into their inheritance. Many of them failed the test, but those who endured with faith saw the fulfillment of God's promise. Jesus Himself demonstrated perfect patience. Though He was the Son of God, He waited until the appointed time to begin His ministry. He spent years in preparation, growing in wisdom and stature before stepping into His divine calling. Even in His interactions with people, He showed patience, teaching His disciples over time and leading them gently instead of forcing them to understand everything at once. His life is a model of endurance and unwavering trust in God's timing. When we embrace waiting as a season of growth rather than frustration, our perspective shifts. We begin to see delays as opportunities for God to shape us into who we need to be for the next season of our lives. Instead of fighting against the waiting, we can lean into it, allowing it to deepen our faith, strengthen our patience, and mold our character. Every great promise of God comes with a process, and it is in the process that He prepares us to walk in the fullness of His plans. It is a joy and an honor to stand before you today. I want to speak to you about something that touches every one of us at some point in life: waiting. You've prayed, you've believed, and yet it seems like heaven is silent. But I want you to hear this truth deep in your heart today. God's delay is not His denial. Just because you haven't seen the answer yet doesn't mean God has forgotten you. You see, our Heavenly Father is never late. He is always on time, working behind the scenes in ways we cannot see. God's timing is always perfect. This truth is one of the most challenging yet comforting realities we must embrace in our journey of faith. Often we find ourselves in seasons of waiting, wondering when God will answer our prayers, fulfill His promises, or bring breakthrough into our lives. In these moments, it is easy to question, doubt, or even become discouraged, but understanding that God's timing is never too early and never too late changes everything. From the very beginning of creation, we see that God operates on His divine timetable. He is never rushed, never delayed, and never makes mistakes in His scheduling. Every event, every blessing, every open and closed door happens precisely when it is meant to. The problem arises when our human impatience collides with God's divine wisdom. We tend to operate on our own timelines, expecting things to unfold in the way and at the pace we desire. When delays come, we often feel forgotten, but God sees the full picture when we can only see a small fragment. One of the most powerful examples of God's perfect timing is found in the life of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, yet for years he and Sarah remained childless. It seemed impossible as time passed, and in their impatience they took matters into their own hands, leading to unnecessary complications. But when the appointed time arrived, Sarah conceived, and Isaac was born, not a moment too soon or too late. This teaches us that no matter how long the wait, God's promises will always come to pass at the right moment. Similarly, consider the story of Joseph. He received a dream as a young man that he would one day be in a position of great leadership. However, his life took a completely different turn, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Year after year, it seemed like the dream would never come to pass. But what Joseph didn't realize was that God was preparing him, refining his character, and aligning circumstances for the perfect time. When the moment was right, Joseph was elevated to the highest position in Egypt, and everything God had promised was fulfilled exactly as he had planned. When we face delays in life, it is easy to assume that something has gone wrong. We might question whether we heard God correctly, or if we did something to disqualify ourselves from His blessings. But the truth is, God is not bound by human schedules. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. What may seem like a delay is often God's way of protecting us, preparing us, or aligning everything for the best possible outcome. In our culture of instant gratification, waiting can feel like an unbearable challenge. We want things now, whether it's success, relationships, financial breakthroughs, or answers to our prayers. However, God does not operate on human impatience. He is more interested in developing our faith, trust, and character than simply giving us what we ask for the moment we ask. Waiting on God requires trust, and trust requires surrender. Surrendering our timeline, our expectations, and our need for control. Many times what looks like a delay is actually a divine setup for something greater. God is often working behind the scenes, orchestrating details that we cannot see. He may be preparing people, opening doors that aren't visible yet, or even changing our own hearts, so that we are ready for what He wants to give us. If we received everything at the moment we wanted it, we might not have the maturity, wisdom, or capacity to handle it properly. God knows exactly what we need and when we need it. Think about the life of Jesus. There were moments when people urged Him to act quickly, to perform miracles on demand, or to reveal Himself before it was time. Yet He always moved according to the Father's will. Even when Lazarus was sick, Jesus delayed going to Him. From a human perspective, it seemed like He was late. Lazarus had already died by the time Jesus arrived. But in God's perfect plan, the delay was necessary for an even greater miracle, raising Lazarus from the dead. What seemed like a late response was actually a divine demonstration of God's power. This same principle applies to our lives. There will be times when we pray, seek, and expect immediate answers, only to find ourselves in a waiting season. But those who trust in God's timing will never be disappointed. His plans are not only good, but also perfectly scheduled. Even when we cannot see the full picture, He is working all things together for our good. When the time is right, no force on earth can stop what God has ordained.